Hi, Barbara. Welcome to the stage of yet another conference on education in Moscow. Of course, a Russian educational community knows a lot about you. And of course, we watch your videos, we listen to all the materials, presentations, and also we definitely know that you perhaps have something to tell us about your way, about what was the road which brought you to where you are now. Would you please tell us something about yourself before we will start talking about what you are doing and about your research?
It is my pleasure and my honor to be here. And I think, like many people, when I was a child, I thought I was good at certain things and not good at other things. And for me, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I thought I hated math. And actually, I did. I really hated mathematics, hated science. I thought, what can I do? Because I was this little kid that I loved animals and knitting and weaving and all those kinds of things. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to learn another language? So I couldn't afford to go anywhere else and, study a language. I couldn't go to college and afford to go to college. But I found out there was one way to learn another language and actually get paid for it, and that was to join the Army. And so I enlisted at age 18, right out of high school, and it was very difficult for me in that, for example, I'm a very clumsy person, so throwing a hand grenade was not something that I found very easy to do. If I look nervous throwing a hand grenade, you know why. But I did learn a language. I am embarrassed to admit, я занималась русским языком, но уже забыла. Это уже 40 лет с тех пор, как я говорила по-русски, и поэтому я говорю по-английски. But I did end up working on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea back in the early 1980s. And I just loved having adventures and seeing the world through new perspectives. So I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, which is where I met my husband. So I like to say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. But I found that just following my passion was not enough. In fact, when I went to leave the Army when I was 26 years old, all of my friends who were involved in technology, they had gone to West Point, they were engineers, they were finding jobs very easily, where I found it much more difficult. So I thought, well, I'm supposed to be open to new adventures and new perspectives, so why don't I see if I can change my brain and actually learn to like math and like science? And so I went to the university and I started at remedial high school algebra. And if I'd known then what I know now about how to learn effectively, I could have made it so much more easy on myself. But I did. I was very slow, but I was successful in learning. So I've had many different careers over the years. But what I've really learned is that it is possible to come from backgrounds that are very, very different and to change your brain and learn and grow. And so this is why I'm so in awe of what Yandex is doing in encouraging education and learning, because for me, it has truly changed my life, just learning more about how to learn effectively.
Thanks a lot. Actually, you just gave us a really nice example of how important is this lifelong learning. But what learning is technically? What does happen inside our brains when we learn?
That is such a good question. I think we haven't been able to see inside the brain before. And so because we couldn't see inside the brain, we kind of think of learning as sort of like this magic that happens. But it really isn't magic. I mean, what it is your brain, even though it's really complicated, Your brain has a very simple set of building blocks, the neuron, that are behind how we learn anything. And a neuron, it has like an arm that reaches upwards, that's called an axon, and some dendrites that are like legs that reach out. And there's these little sprouts called dendritic spines that also are on those dendrites. And those little dendritic spines are crucial to our learning. And here's how. When we're learning something, we're actually making connections between neurons. So a finger on that arm reaches out and it connects those neurons together as we learn anything. So it's making a connection of groups of neurons in long-term memory. And long-term memory is in the neocortex. So whether you're learning to take a derivative in math, how to conjugate a verb in that strange English language, or do a dance step, or whatever you're learning, you're just making connections between neurons in long-term memory. The more you practice, of course, the more that you're able to build and strengthen those sets of connections. And as you practice, those sets of links get stronger and thicker and richer. And of course, that is when you've learned something really well. So those sets of links that you create as you're learning something are stored in your neocortex, as I mentioned. And the neocortex is actually, your neurons are, of course, and those sets of links of neurons are very small, and they're way down into that felt-like layer of neocortex that covers the top of your brain. And that layer, actually, if you look at it and spread it out, is like, it's about a 2.5 millimeter thick piece of felt, about the size of a dinner napkin. And that's where all our memories are stored, in learning. So learning is not something that, you can always just look it up. Learning actually means building an architecture of knowledge through connected neurons in your long-term memory in the neocortex.
Okay. Thank you so much for explaining these complicated matters with such a simple words. And it's a really useful scientific background. However, what are practical implications of all these things? How does it help us to learn quicker, to learn better, to learn more efficiently?
The way it helps us is that it can give us practical insight on which methods of learning are actually going to be most helpful for us. So, for example, let's say that you have 4 different ways that you could use to learn. You could reread something or underline, or maybe make flashcards and retrieve that idea from your own mind, or use something called concept mapping, where you get the key ideas and write them out and connect them together. So which of those 4 ways is actually the most useful? It turns out that the most useful way of learning is to use what's called retrieval practice. That's sort of the flashcard technique. In other words, when you learn something, your initial learning makes it so that you've got a nice set of links, but it's very weak. But each time you retrieve that idea from your own mind, you're actually strengthening those sets of links. So it's retrieval practice that is the most powerful technique for learning. And interestingly, you might say, oh, come on, that's not true. It's teaching other people. That's the best way to learn. But teaching other people is just using retrieval practice. It's getting things from your own mind in order to strengthen those neural connections.
Okay, that all sounds practical. However, one question still remains. I believe that education is always about not just interaction between a student and the source of knowledge. It's also, and perhaps in the first place, an interaction between people. So where are persons in this educational process? And also, we people are all very different. So how does all this difference affect
Okay, so we're
educational
ready. Okay.
processes?
So, Andrew, that is such a good question because ultimately it is always people who inspire us, great teachers who inspire us. And I think the perfect example of that is my favorite athlete of all time, whose name is Julius YaC. Julius was from Kenya. And if you know anything about Kenya, you know it's famous for its long distance runners. But Julius didn't want to be a long distance runner. He wanted to learn to throw the javelin. So he couldn't afford to go to another country and study. There were no javelin throwing coaches in Kenya. So what he did was he looked for YouTube videos of incredibly good instructors of throwing the javelin. And what he would do is he'd watch this great teacher, and then he would go out and practice, watch and practice. And do you know that 98% of the time, just by doing that, he became the world champion in throwing the javelin. So it shows us that actually we can learn a lot online, but even that interaction of having a good teacher teaching through video can still be incredibly effective for people. Now, what does this mean, though, when, as far as a classroom situation? We've often thought that that learning, well, for years, for many centuries, a classroom is we get a bunch of people together for several hours, and then after we get these people together, we teach them through lecture. But lecture is not very effective as far as learning goes. I mean, it is effective, but also people can tune out if it goes too long. So then this idea arose that active learning is really important, having students actively engage with the material. But there's a problem with that too, because you can't just always actively engage with the material if you don't get taught initially what you should be actively engaging with. So then it kind of became, people began to acknowledge that, yes, you need a mixture of active learning plus lecture. What percentage, we don't really know. But this mixture of active learning and lecture is called direct instruction. And direct instruction is something that that good teachers often do automatically, mixing in their explanation with the student actually actively practicing. And this is what Julius YaC did. In fact, he would watch the video. He could have watched a real person instead. And then he would go forth and he would go out and practice with the javelin. So he'd learn, he'd practice, learn and practice. And what was this? It was actually just a mixture of lecture with active learning. It was direct instruction. So what does this have to do, though, with how the brain actually learns? A lot. So I'd mentioned those sets of links that you create when you are learning something new. One thing I didn't mention was those sets of links are created through two different pathways. So one of the pathways is through the hippocampus. So that is called declarative learning. You go from working memory in the prefrontal cortex through the hippocampus into long-term memory. The other pathway is procedural. So you go from your input sensors through the basal ganglia into long-term memory. Each of those two different ways of learning can actually help so that a student learns a material well. You need to teach through both mechanisms in order for students to learn effectively. So declarative learning, very good retrieval practice, and procedural learning will learn through retrieval practice, spaced repetition over a number of days. But procedural learning also benefits greatly from practice. So I mentioned working memory. I should say that working memory capacities vary quite a bit. People can hold, it's almost like a quadrupus on average. People have maybe 4 arms that they can hold pieces of information in their prefrontal cortex. Some people have 3, others have many arms that they can hold pieces of information. But the reality is, those who have many arms in their working memory, they can hold a lot of information, they can learn very swiftly. So I think of those as race car learners. And race car learners can get to the finish line very fast, but it all goes by in a blur. So the other kind of learner, more like me, is lesser capacity working memory, but think about what it's kind of like a hiker learner. The hiker learner, they get to the finish line slowly, but they can see the birds, they can see the little rabbit trails, smell the pine in the air, hear the birds singing. It's a completely different experience, and in some ways far richer and deeper. So in fact, Nobel Prize winners are even hiker learners. They learn more slowly, but they see that the mistakes that those race cars have just jumped over. So as a teacher or as a learner, you can learn well. Race cars can jump high buildings and learn complex concepts all at once. Hikers can learn it just as well, but if you scaffold that instruction by breaking it up into smaller chunks, they can learn more swiftly, and of course, they might need more practice, but they can get there and be just as good a learner.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. Special thanks for your metaphor about hiking. I am a hiker, and I do know from my personal experience that the road is not only about getting to the destination, it's also about the process of moving there. So yes, I do understand what did you mean, and thanks again. Barbara, now thousands, maybe tens of thousands of educators all across Russia and maybe beyond are watching you. Do you have something to wish so that these people will be inspired by today's your speech and by all our conference today?
Oh, of course, I wish you to know that there are ways to learn whether you're a fast or a slow learner. My hero in science is Santiago Ramon y Cajal, and Cajal was a terrible learner. It was very, very difficult for him. He was kicked out of schools. He only really began trying to learn a little bit of math when he was 20 years old. But he became a professor of anatomy, and then he won the Nobel Prize. And now he's considered the father of modern neuroscience. And what Cajal said, he was asked, how did you do this? And he said, well, I'm not a genius. But he said, I have worked with many geniuses. And the challenge with geniuses is they can jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they just use their intellect to justify why they must have been right after all. So if you, like Cajal, are no genius, rejoice, because you can sometimes do things even geniuses cannot. Thank you so much, Andrew. Happy learning.
Thank you, Barbara, again. It was a pleasure, unfortunately a very short one, but I do hope that someday we will meet you, we will see you here in Moscow in person, physically. But right now, thanks and bye.